Well, I want to thank all of you that braved the elements in coming here this evening. Peerless Bookstore and Books for Heroes is incredibly proud of having Senator Steve Russell come to the first book signing. The book came out today, guys, you know? To make this part happen, there are so many thank yous that would actually take all night. It would be an event on its own. But I do want to thank West Plan investors. They're the ones who donated this space for Books for Heroes operations. I want to thank my wife for scrubbing the floors, and a few other people, a few authors coming in here and painting the logo, and someone loaned us the flag, and a local church, loaned us the chairs. Books for Heroes is a true 501c3. It's a nonprofit. I don't make a paycheck. Nobody in this organization makes a paycheck. All money that comes in ships books to soldiers serving our country. So I want to thank all of you for being a part of this. I'd like to introduce Bob Babcock. He knows Steve far better than I do, although I have found out all sorts of very good information online, and talked to a couple of other people that have crossed his paths over the years, and not one of them have said anything. I'd be proud to call him a friend at some time. I seriously would. But I'd like to introduce Bob Babcock, who originally published We Got Him. And he's the publisher and the president of Deeds Publishing out of Marietta. So if you don't mind, I'd like to introduce Bob.
Thank you. I had the honor of serving in the 22nd Infantry Regiment that Steve commanded. Not at the same time. He's a little older than I am. But Steve commanded 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry in Iraq, which he will tell you about it. And I knew his predecessor very well because I happened to be at the time the president of the 22nd Infantry Regiment Society. So I know all the battalion commanders. And here we've got this new guy named Steve Russell, and I'm seeing him on the news all the time, and I still haven't met him. So we became friends via email. And then when he came home in March to Fort Hood in March of 2004, I was down there and met Steve and Cindy, his wife, and we have been friends ever since. Steve is a true American hero. And I don't say that very often. I don't like the hero word because it's often used wrong in this country anymore. But Steve is truly that. He was a leader who led from the front. Steve's troops, you can find any of them, they love him. And there's a reason, because he's that kind of a leader. The second part about Steve, when he chose to retire from the Army, he did it for good reasons, family reasons. And he was called by the current Chief of Staff of the Army, Ray Odierno, and said, Steve, what in the world are you doing? You can't do that. We need you. And he explained why for my family. I'm going to take my family back to Oklahoma, God's country, where we're both from, and we're going to raise a family there. He is today a state senator. You haven't heard the last of Steve Russell. But now we're going to let him get up here and talk about this fabulous book, because he and I talked a year ago about this book. We published it, and the beauty of it is Simon & Schuster loved it, so they bought it, and today is a major step forward, spring forward, in the life of We Got Him. Steve Russell, come on, buddy.
Well, thanks for coming tonight. Really appreciate you all carrying on a rainy night to just come out. How do you start when it comes to dealing with a book? A number of authors out here, you have an idea, you have a passion, you have something that you want to get written out of you. And as I, this past weekend, reflected And even today, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and New York Journal of Books, in the last 3 days have reviewed the book, and I'm like, holy cow. It's very humbling, because you don't know if the passion of what you've put in is going to exit across the page, as people would read. And so any of you that are writing or have written or have published, I just applaud you, because I know how hard that is to work on all of that. And I often sign my books with the phrase, don't quit. And that would be the same thing I would tell you tonight. I want to read a few passages from the book to you that will kind of frame up some things. As Bob mentioned, I was able to...
Sorry.
That's okay. I was able to command the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry at Tikrit, Iraq. We had no idea when we deployed in the spring of 2003 that we would be a part of something historic, and did not have a clue. Many people think that the Saddam capture was the result of some lofty intelligence handed down, or the result of CIA operatives in the field, or some satellites, peering down and saying, look, there he is, go get him. And nothing could be further from the truth. It was the result of 6 months of very hard work by 2 Special Operations Forces teams working hand in hand with our task force and other battalions in the 1st Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division. And I had the privilege to command one of those units. The title of the book is We Got Him, not I Got Him. It was a team effort, and it's a great testimony to the skill and the ingenuity of our soldiers when we asked them to do the hard things. And so I felt a moral obligation coming home to tell this story and to get it out for the public record, not only to record it accurately, but also as a participant to write some things out of me from my wartime experiences. Mister, I must see Colonel Russell, he said with a friendly face. His brother stood nearby, nodding and smiling. What is your business? Asked one of my soldiers at the Civil Military Information Center. I heard the colonel is here, and we have some very important information. So it was always. Mr. I must see, or Mr. I need, or some such demand or query. The Civil Military Information Center, or CIMIC, despite its battered facade from the firefight a week before, appeared to be serving its purpose. Nevertheless, many Iraqis were fearful of initiating an encounter with the Americans, terrified of being branded as collaborators. Some countered this with the assertion of the Arab tradition for bakshish, the cultural habit to demand favor and get it from those that have it. I had already determined not to spend much time there, other than to check on security. Unlike Mark, my predecessor, I felt that we must secure the city before worrying about local relations. I believe the real key to local security was contending with emerging government, civic, and tribal leaders rather than look into broken window complaints. But I also recognized that the CIMIC was needed as a place for Iraqis to redress grievances. I would grow to hate it and call for its abandonment in time, but for the present, it served a purpose. Sir, sorry to interrupt, but there are 2 guys out here demanding to see you, informed the sergeant, drenched in sweat. Yeah, I bet. Them and everyone else, I answered, begrudgingly, also miserable in a sweat-soaked uniform. Sir, I think they're serious. They don't look like the others we've had here today, speculated the sergeant. When I told them to pass the information to me so I could get it to you, they refused. They said they would leave first. All right, I surrendered. Bring them in after they've been searched. I was naively oblivious to the significance of this moment. Afterward, I felt completely stupid for nearly missing something so major it could have changed the course of history. Colonel Rasul, they smiled and extended hands. We have heard so much about you. My name is Ahmed, and this is my brother Nahed. It's a pleasure to meet you. I smiled and shook their hands. How can I help you? Please, mister, can we go to some place private? We have some information. I had seen it all before, but these two intrigued me. There was something about the look in their eyes, warmth and honesty. It was hard to describe. Yes, please, of course, come this way. We sat on battered furniture scavenged from buildings in various degrees of ruin. I called for drinks, mindful of the Arab tradition of hospitality. After learning more about them, I was curious about what they would tell me. The brothers were businessmen with a penchant for survival. They lived in Al-Oja, Saddam's birth village. They were once landowners and men of influence, but Saddam had killed their father and seized their land for the village as it now existed, with its well-appointed houses for Saddam's closest cronies. They leave us alone now, explained Ahmed. We stay by the river. We have a business in Jordan also, so we travel and are able to get by. Nahed seemed to understand English, but was much less confident in speaking it. Without a translator, I had to rely on the rudimentary English skills of the Iraqis who visited the CIMIC and hope for the best. In a couple of days, I would make a plea to Major General Odierno to obtain a translator for my task force. Being the kind of soldier and commander he was, he gave me his personal one. Joe Fillmore was an American born in Iraq, whose father was on the Iraqi Supreme Court in 1968. His family fled when the Baathists came to power, and Joe would later serve in the United States Navy. He volunteered his language skills when we geared up for Iraq and was assigned to General Odierno. He would be a translator of the first rank, but as of yet, I did not have him. Fortunately, Ahmed's English was excellent. You need to understand something, Ahmed whispered as he scanned the room and closed the door. Saddam is still in the area. He's being protected. They travel in cars with dark windows. You need to stop all of those cars. What do you mean? I inquired. Who is protecting him? There are many, he answered. Great, here we go. More Arab histrionics about having information and elaborate tales that will send us on yet another wild goose chase. There are certain families, he declared flatly. I was not expecting this. For the next hour and a half, the brothers explained Saddam's pre-war security apparatus. The network revolved around 5 controlling families who had known Saddam since his youth, roughly since the 1950s. They had intermarried and were trusted. The first group is called Saddam's Special Bodyguard, Ahmed explained, about the group composed of Saddam's most requested bodyguards. There are 20 to 25 of them, and they are with him everywhere and every day. The bodyguards live in white houses. We have seen them now, back in Tikrit. That is why we know they are here. The next group was called the 40. Only later did I learn that the group lived in a south-central section of Tikrit that we mistakenly called 40th Street. It was really the Street of the 40, which explained why we had so much trouble there. These were a second layer of bodyguards who served as Saddam's functionaries, attending to his every need. They drove, cooked, gardened, machined, and attended, while being very much a group of bodyguards. They were completely trusted by Saddam. The third layer was composed of groups known as Saddam's Special Soldiers Unit. They have maybe 1,000 in each group, estimated Ahmed. They go on the routes where Saddam travels and look for trouble. He may send several of the groups on different routes and then take only one. The meeting wrapped up with an exchange of contact information and the assurance that I would not expose them to undue danger. I realized if this information were true, they had risked much in coming here. As they left, I remember thinking that this was either the most elaborate lie I ever fabricated, or that it must be completely true. Shortly, we would become thoroughly familiar with these families that they told us about, with names like Muslit, Hadoshi, Hassan, Katab, and Majid as they began to emerge. We commingled this information with the intelligence collected to date, information previously lacking. Coherency started to make sense. Our missions to date had been largely dictated by what was called the blacklist. They were the names of the infamous 52 detailed on the deck of cards. That brilliant piece of public relations work whereby Saddam's government officials and most wanted enemies were grouped together and pictured on decks of playing cards to aid in their capture. Additionally, the blacklist had the names of those core or divisional targets that various intelligence sections deemed important. This was something entirely different. As I pondered the details the brothers had imparted, I began to speculate on the scope of our task by asking myself a series of simple questions I had learned to do in wars and training past. What did the enemy look like? How could he hurt us? How could we hurt him? We knew that there were street fighters launching attacks on our soldiers. Someone had to be organizing them. I decided to reduce the possibilities in simple terms to communicate a strategy for our soldiers. I called it the 3 tiers. The first tier was the deck of cards guys. These were Saddam and his henchmen. The third tier I called the trigger pullers, those that were scrapping with us on the streets. But who was in the middle? The brothers had not only given us the immediate answer, but also much more. The second tier I called the bodyguards. They were the conduit between Saddam, his personal protection, and the foot soldiers he would inspire. If we could somehow identify and locate this second tier, then in theory, we could disrupt those organizing the attacks and perhaps find trails leading to the big guys. The problem was unearthing a way to expose their identity. With the brothers' information and the intelligence already possessed, we at least had enough to get started. From this point on, what happened was we worked very closely with a team of special operations soldiers led by a guy that I'll call Jack. And as we began to make a construct of what the strategy was, we would try to find this group of bodyguards, Saddam's social networks. Who was it that he trusted? And as you would break into the families, each raid or each success would lead to others. In June, we captured Abid Mahmoud, who was the ace of diamonds on the deck of cards. Important guy. He was Saddam's presidential secretary. So important that he was ranked number 4 behind Saddam and his 2 sons. Biggest catch of the war up to that time. Within a few weeks of that, we had captured Saddam's number 1 personal bodyguard. We nearly got Saddam in a raid on the Hadoshi farm, where we captured his wife's passport, her traveling jewelry of $2 million, over $10 million of Saddam's cash, which you'll see in the book, picture of me sitting on it. If you want to know what it's like to sit on $10 million, it's quite a thrill. But the strategy essentially was working, and the enemy didn't sit idle. They pushed back on us, and we had this cat and mouse game going all through the summer. And we were taking a toll on them. But they got more effective and better organized with the insurgent network that was still inspired by Saddam himself. They began to continue to get funding and some pretty deadly weaponry as they pushed back. The closer we got to them, the more fierce they became. And a lot of people think that the Saddam capture was a bloodless affair. Well, the raid that got him was, but the trail leading up to it had a heavy cost. Skipping ahead, November 7th dawned with somewhat cooler weather, but by mid-morning evolved into a very pleasant day. General John Abizaid, the commander of the entire Central Command, or CENTCOM, arrived for an update from the leadership of the 4th Infantry Division. He and Major General Odierno came to the 1st Brigade at approximately 9 a.m. to meet with all the battalion commanders and our own commander, Colonel Jim Hickey. I had served with General Abizaid in Kosovo and Germany when he commanded the 1st Infantry Division. Colonel Hickey's headquarters was in its usual immaculate state. God help the soldier that screwed that up. Colonel Hickey could be calm and reserved and was as brave as any soldier in his command, but he was well known for his ability to strike fear in members of his staff. We even joked amongst ourselves about which member of his staff was serving as the human piñata on a particular day. Today, he seemed quite satisfied. In addition to the impressive array of easy-to-read maps and charts posted, there were partitions around the commander's briefing area. It was a display of a different kind, a feathered one. Some weeks before, our friend Brigadier General Abdullah Hussein Muhammad had presented Colonel Hickey with a falcon. As a skilled falconer, General Abdullah felt that any warrior such as Colonel Hickey should have a bird of prey of his own. The falcon, now dubbed Sky Raider as a nod to the 1st Raider Brigade, was indeed impressive. The Predator had his own perch and a litany of soldiers rostered to tend to his every need. Most of the time, he sat motionless, but for an occasional blink and head shift, always scanning, always ready to strike. It was only fitting that Sky Raider found a place at this important brief among insurgent predators. At a moment of serious discussion between Colonel Hickey and General Abizaid about the motivations of the insurgency, Sky Raider went bonkers. Tethered as he was by the foot, he became helplessly enmeshed in his own line. His claws and wings were dramatically splayed across the partition, and down and feathers drifted through the air. And the amusing scene reached a crescendo with the bird's shrieking calls for help. "Is that thing okay?" asked the U.S. commander of all forces from Africa to Central Asia. As if on cue, a pair of gloved hands appeared from behind the partition, first bracing and then whisking the entangled creature up and over the partition. Sky Raider's contribution to the briefing added little to solving the complexities of guerrilla warfare, but certainly furnished a memorable and entertaining break in the gravity of war. Colonel Hickey's pre-Sky Raider update resumed and actually went very well. We had frank and open discussions with General Abizaid about the best method for gathering intelligence. The general was impressed with our observations and later passed them on to other units. He confirmed that our leads on Saddam and his network were good and encouraged us to operate in the confidence that everyone develops patterns. Saddam would be no different. He assured us. He closed with some guidance to all the commanders and offered his vision of the future of the war. Even as Sky Raider was having his convulsions and we were in deep discussion with General Abizaid, Selwan Adnan Hamdi al-Nafat and his brother Sufyan gathered in the northern suburb of Qadisiyah in Tikrit at a friend's house to have a discussion of their own. They were now ready to execute a plot received from the area insurgent commander, a member of the Muslit family named Finar Katab Omar al-Muslit. Saddam, they were advised, had conceived this new strategy himself. Selwan and Sufyan, in possession of a long tube-like object known locally as a Hatashi missile, took up a position near the riverbank of the Tigris. They were alive with anticipation. These were the new Russian-made SA-16 anti-aircraft missiles that had just been smuggled in from Syria. A mole working in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Tikrit had alerted them to another flight of American helicopters skimming south along the Tigris River from Mosul. First Lieutenant Phil Thompson from our tank company was patrolling with 2 M1 tanks and his gun Hummer along Highway 1 in the northern Tikriti suburb of Qadisiyah in search of bombs. Sakir Ghani, a local resident of the Qadisiyah district, observed Thompson's patrol as he sat with several other men going through their morning ritual of small talk and tea. He cursed under his breath, still stinging that relatives of his had been captured by the evil Americans a few days before for insurgent activity. To the north, he could hear helicopters. He wondered what the Americans were up to and where they would strike next. He was relieved when Thompson's patrol passed by without stopping. A pair of Black Hawk helicopters clipped south along the Tigris River, aiming toward the helipad at the 4th Infantry Division headquarters just a few kilometers distant. The birds flew just above ground level, but perhaps 300 feet above the water. Chief Warrant Officer Kieran Kennedy had flown this route dozens of times, but he and his co-pilot, Captain Ben Smith, were particularly vigilant that day as they were transporting some especially important visitors. With several of the highest-ranking Staff Judge Advocate, or SJA personnel, on this mission, the passenger load was split between two birds making the flight. Smith and Kennedy would fly trail carrying Command Sergeant Major Cornell Gilmore, the Army's senior Staff Judge Advocate enlisted soldier. Staff Sergeant Paul Neff and Sergeant Scott Rose, the crew chief and engineer, trained their machine guns on the bluffs and rooftops of houses dotting the bank's edge. Kennedy looked forward to a little downtime in Tikrit. His wife had just sent him a beautiful case line with red flannel for his handmade dulcimer. It arrived in time for his 43rd birthday the week before. He had crafted the hammer dulcimer himself on their farm in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, near Fort Campbell, where they were stationed. Now it would be protected as he carried it around. Flying the rich farmland along the Tigris reminded Kennedy a little bit of home. He liked the simple life, even though he was actually a Boston native. Clearly, the Kentucky farm he and his wife, Kathy, and their 3 children lived on was far better looking than anything over here. In the back sat Chief Warrant Officer Sharon Swartworth, accompanying her commanding general on her last assignment with the Staff Judge Advocate Office. She had already sold her house in the D.C. area and would retire after this brief interlude to visit troops in Iraq. She had been excited about this opportunity to see things firsthand, capping a great career. Tomorrow would be her 44th birthday, and she never imagined that she would celebrate it in Tikrit, Iraq. She looked forward to returning home to live in paradise, as she put it, as her naval captain husband had just received orders to Hawaii. Major General Thomas J. Romig, the Army's senior lawyer and highest ranking one, sat in the lead bird. As the chopper began to ease up and prepare for landing on the helipad just ahead, he felt relieved to have made it to Tikrit without incident. He had important work on this trip concerning the testimony and allegations of Iraqis held in custody by American forces. One thing was certain: he wanted to ensure that his soldiers had the best support possible and encouraged them to operate with the full confidence to protect U.S. soldiers from undue criminal allegations as they attempted to sort out the enemy in this difficult insurgent war. After passing Secure Ghani and his tea-drinking cronies at approximately 9:40 a.m., First Lieutenant Phil Thompson patrolled south close to the riverbank with his tank men. He caught a flash out of the corner of his eye. A flaming rooster tail spewed from a Black Hawk helicopter as another one flew on ahead. The trail bird was obviously in serious trouble as it struggled for altitude. The nose began to pitch forward. Secure Ghani, seeing virtually the same thing from his location, began to jump and shout, "Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar," as he and the other tea drinkers shared in the jubilation. Regular Mike, this is Cougar 5, over, called Thompson. Regular Mike, over, came the reply. "I just saw a Black Hawk go down near my location. I'm heading there with my patrol," announced Lieutenant Thompson as he switched radio handsets to contact his own company. Chief Kennedy and Captain Smith felt a violent bang and immediately lost control of their craft. Affectionately known as the Goat, this was bad, very bad. Where to land? Black Hawk number 92-26431 was going down. No time. The pilots used what little control they had to aim for a sandbar island to avoid the river. The rail, or the tail section, gave way completely as the craft began a violent somersault. Debris, weapons, and soldiers fell from the stricken craft before it completely disappeared below the river bluff. Phil Thompson quickly gathered a small force of 3 tanks and 3 gun Hummers and raced to the bluff. What he saw below did not look good. As he secured the bank and checked for enemy activity, Staff Sergeant David McLean and Sergeant Joseph Jago scrambled on foot down the tenuous cliff trail to the island land bridge below. A grisly, flaming scene rose before them. Our battalion headquarters could track Phil's location with his digital tracking system. Headquarters company security outposts also could see the fire on the sandbar island north of their location, and they called in the approximate grid. Within minutes, our task force spurred into action. Major Mike Rahud radioed my driver, Cody Hofer, and then dispatched forces to the location in my absence. Captain Brad Boyd darted a patrol north from his downtown location, while Captain Mark Stouffer alerted his quick reaction force already on standby in the city. Command Sergeant Major Pete Martinez was holding a promotion board with several of the company first sergeants when the word came. Suddenly, soldiers from every one of our companies burst into action. Staff Sergeant McLean and Sergeant Jago continued to thread their way down the tenuous trail to the island. What they saw was traumatic. The helicopter lay scattered along a straight pattern, perhaps 100 yards long. The lighter the pieces, the less distance they traveled. The main body of the aircraft tumbled into a ball and burned profusely. McLean and Jago raced to the disconnected parts of the wreckage looking for American soldiers. Phil Thompson met Captain Brad Boyd at the top of the bluff. Brad took charge of the site as Phil's Cougars and Brad's Cobras worked together to do what they could. Mike Rahud began feeding everything to Brad, who was now the senior commander on site. Sergeant Major Cesar Castro, who had been out checking up on the Cobras, followed after them. We now had a very able force to work the grisly task at hand. The sandbar was covered with bulrushes and monkey grass, about 8 to 10 feet high. About a quarter of the island was on fire and the flames were spreading. Aluminum, magnesium, and steel morphed from aerodynamic marble to molten mass as the wreckage burned intensely. Brad and our soldiers hastily searched for survivors in the wreckage. I emerged from the meeting with General Abbassade shortly after 10 a.m. My driver and ops sergeant reported the news to me. We sped north to Codicea, arriving about 10 minutes later. The island was belching smoke and flame. My first priority was to extinguish the fire, so recovery of remains and aircraft could begin. As I took in the scene before me, I could not imagine any humans surviving this inferno. We drove down to the island. I called Mike Rahud for fire trucks, army or city, it didn't matter. We needed serious help to contain the flames. Until they arrived, there was little we could do. I ordered Brad Boyd and Mark Stouffer to make sure security was tight. The enemy was active, and we could be vulnerable to mortar or sniper attack. Look, a couple of things need to happen, I told my two company commanders on site. First, we need to recover the bodies and all the equipment. These Blackhawks are usually armed with waist guns. We need to find those and any personal weapons and gear that may have been scattered over the area. Second, we need to sanitize this site once we secure it and the aircraft is properly recovered. I want nothing for the Iraqis to gloat over. I want it to look as if this never happened. We're going to be here a while until we get all of this cleaned up. There will be no dancing Iraqis on any helicopters. Roger, sir, they acknowledged. Sir, we've consolidated the remains in Charlie 7 and can take them wherever they need to go, informed Brad. Let's make sure we have everybody, I answered. I'll try to get the Graves registration folks out here to recover them properly. Investigators will want to know exactly what happened here, so we need to make a sketch and note what we find and where we found it. As we conferred, flames began to spread. While not yet critical, we had to douse the flames before they spread to the dense monkey grass and burn whatever might be scattered in it, whether survivors, bodies, or wreckage. Sergeant First Class Gilbert Nail, Cody Hofer, and I began to stamp out the flames to try to clear the trail running down to the island. First Sergeant Mike Evans and some of his Cobras spotted us and came to help. We whacked the grass, stomped the ground, and tried to contain it to the areas already burned. Captain Jason Deal and the Iraqi civil defense soldiers arrived and began to assist. Soon we were making a little headway. Jason, take your men to the north end of the island and look for wreckage and remains, I called out. Roger, sir, Captain Deal replied as he moved with his sergeants and Iraqi soldiers up the trail. With the flames contained, we focused on the wreckage at the south end of the island. Sir, we've found some equipment back over there in one of the machine guns, updated Major Brian Luke, who had gone with Jason's men. Sir, we only have 4.5 bodies, reported Captain Boyd. 4.5, I replied. Yes, sir, When we first came down, Sergeant Madrid, Venegas, and I found a leg that doesn't belong to any of the others that we found so far. Well, we need to find the rest of them and consolidate them all over there, I instructed, pointing to a clearing near the path that climbed back up the bluff. Brian, we got to know how many we're talking about here. We need to know the manifest. Roger, sir. We know more than anyone at brigade right now, but maybe we can get them to ping higher, he replied. Pete Martinez and Captain Alex Morales arrived with an ambulance from battalion headquarters to help in casualty aid. Brad informed them that only bodies had been recovered so far. Without hesitation, they began placing the corpses into body bags. As the search continued, Brian Luke pulled me aside. "Sir, look at this," he said softly as he showed me a smoldered desert camo top. On it were the 2 stars of a major general. The name tag said Ramig, and my heart sank. "Roger, I'll call it up," I muttered in dismay. "Was he in it?" "That's the thing, sir. We only found the uniform," Brian explained. "Well, let's pray he was on the other bird," I offered. I walked to my Hummer and called brigade on the point-to-point tactical satellite phone for privacy. I briefed the brigade staff on our findings. They stated that Ramig was not on board the downed bird and had landed safely. I asked about the manifest. Brigade confirmed a crew of 4 and 2 passengers. One was the JAG Sergeant Major, and one was a female warrant. I validated the body count so far and hung up the receiver. "Brad, are there any bodies of women?" "No, sir." "Well, we're missing 1.5 people then. One is a female warrant." Staff Sergeant Matthew Rose from C Company had split off from Brad's group to stamp out a fire he saw flaring up. The fire was on the side of the chopper leaning toward the ground. He started pouring water from his canteen to put out the flames that he could not stamp out because of the wreckage. As he did, he noticed something inside the helicopter. "Sir, we got a body," called out Sergeant Rose. Brad, Mike Evans, Medic Staff Sergeant Philippe Madrid, and I advanced to the crushed compartment of the aircraft. Slumped over and still buckled in was the female soldier. Her hair was still pulled back in a bun. Her head was tilted downward, and a wisp of smoke still rose from her charred body and clothing. Out of respect to her memory, I will not describe the remainder of the scene. We unbuckled her seatbelt and tried to extricate her, but it was impossible. Her lower torso was pinned by the wreckage. "We're going to need recovery assets to remove her," I commented. "Let's get her tags." We lifted her head. Staff Sergeant Rose grabbed the dog tags and removed them with care and dignity. He handed them to me. I put the bloody, smoldered identification in my pocket. There was really nothing more we could do. Shortly afterward, Brian Luke and a group of men to the north found the dismembered soldier. We also recovered what appeared to be all the aircraft armament and personal weapons. With everything accounted for, the gruesome task of recovery began. As we worked, several leaders from our division and other units arrived. Brigadier General Mike Barbero was the first on the scene. Recovery was delayed due to concerns about the aircraft investigation. I gave him a rundown and showed him an initial sketch of what had been found. Once he grasped the situation, he thanked us and allowed the recovery to press forward. Soon, the Fallen Soldiers Battalion Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Laura Richardson, arrived with Colonel Mike Moody from our division's Aviation Brigade and thanked us for responding so quickly. We assured them that we would secure the site and recover the human remains in the wreckage. By nightfall, all this had been accomplished. We carried the wreckage to the same spot we deposited the helicopter from the October 25th shoot-down. Nearly all of it had been saved from the grass fires, allowing for a more thorough investigation. It was an exhausting, tragic day. I had left the scene by late afternoon to confer with Colonel Hickey at my headquarters. We were determined to shake up the town. This would not stand. While we had inflicted great loss upon the enemy recently and were ripping into his networks, it was clear he still had the resources to strike back. The insurgents and the local population that continued to harbor them had to understand that the American army was more than just Humvees. We were tougher and more determined, and we would sap the motivation right out of them. That night, I reflected on the abominable events of the previous 12 hours. The next few days produced many reports on these soldiers in the news. Learning about their lives made the manner of their death even more repugnant to me. That was the strange part. Unlike wars in the past, news of military deaths was being broadcast worldwide before the bodies and wreckage turned cold. In fact, reporters were trying to film our recovery efforts from the bluff, even as we sifted through the ruins and remains below. In the next few days, I would try to couple the horrific scenes of the soldiers' demise with the bereaved comments from their loved ones. As I studied on the internet smiling photos of them in happier times, I was thankful that their relatives didn't see the carnage that we witnessed. Soldiers carry such memories for life. Thankfully, their families could remember them the way they were. The brutal deaths of more fellow American soldiers angered me. They died in my town on my watch, and I failed to prevent it. My head knew that the enemy was fully accountable for these grievous crimes, but my heart could not help but wonder if we could have done something different. It is an unfortunate reality of war that the enemy also gets a vote on the battlefield. When men endeavor to kill one another, both sides can succeed, but it's he who is left standing that matters. Well, within about 5 more weeks, our rating had picked up incredible momentum, and a lot of the folks that we had been pursuing for months, we had really narrowed down to a key few individuals. It really began to snowball in amazing ways. We found the trail that would lead us to Muhammad al-Muslid, who was the key guy. You remember the last public appearance of Saddam, when the Marines were on one side of the city and 3rd Infantry Division was on the other, and Saddam goes out in the town square and he gets up on top of a car and he's being the benevolent dictator and everybody's cheering him. Well, the next time you see that footage, you'll see a guy get up on the back of the car and he has a pistol in his hand protecting Saddam. Well, that was Muhammad al-Muslid. Virtual unknown before the war. But once we got onto him and his family and the networks that surrounded him, we knew that he was important. In fact, he had even driven Saddam out of Baghdad to Hit and then later in the Tikrit area. We were able to get on his trail through a series of raids in the weeks that followed until Muslid had been captured. Within 24 hours of Muslid's capture, we were on the raid that would net Saddam himself. Caius, whose full name was Caius Namak Jassim, settled down for a quiet evening. The air cooled slightly as long fingers of waning light filtered through the trees in the orchard. He liked this time of year with its forgiving temperatures, blooming desert, and rich growing season. The citrus trees and towering date palms were laden with their bounty. In the near distance, the gentle ripples of the sun-dappled Tigris signaled a powerful undercurrent as the river swelled with winter rain. The fishing would be good. There was still some work to do, but the evening promised to be a pleasant one. He needed to prepare a meal for his guest now. That was his job. Caius and his brother, both caretakers who had served him for many years, enjoyed conversation with him, but were acutely aware of the need to be vigilant at every moment. The American patrols could appear at any time. Several close calls had taught them that seconds counted. In the last few months, the Americans had materialized undetected on his farm hut patio several times, but had found nothing. They had been lucky thus far. He was confident that their contingency plan was far too clever for the Americans. They would never find their guest. He looked weary. Still, there was a quiet strength in the guest's demeanor. He might have looked like a farmer with his common attire and unkempt beard. But one look across the river toward Ojia was a reminder of his importance. Down at the riverbank, one could still glimpse the magnificence of his mansion standing stalwartly, even majestically, on the distant hillside. Not even the American bombs could bring it down. Certainly it had been damaged. Even so, it remained, just like their guest. The Americans had tried to break him for decades and could not. Now, though they occupied the entire country, their search for him had been in vain. Caius was glad that since their guest had begun life as a humble farmer on this land, the hardship was not intolerable for him. He and his brother could prepare meals and tend to their guests' needs until things got back on track. The setbacks were many, but there were also substantial setbacks for the occupiers as well. Soon they would leave, and their leader could restore power. He had endured similar hardship in 1958 under parallel circumstances and escaped from this very farm. Fate had brought him back. He would survive again. With the setting sun obscured, the lights of Adour to the south and Tikrit to the north framed the horizon. As Caius prepared for the evening, the electricity failed again. This was not at all unusual, but it did cause him to wonder. Canting an ear toward the distance, he could hear the low rumble of approaching vehicles. He strained his eyes through the lattice fence towards the wheat field to the east, but could see nothing. Still, he didn't like the sound of things. He could hear too many vehicles in the distance. He began to hear what sounded like helicopters. Caius' mind began to race. Quick, hurry, no time. The carpet, move it. Get the ropes, please hurry. Be careful, are you okay? Take this pistol, get down. Brother, we must get this covered. No, they're coming. They're coming, run, run. Caius and his brother snapped through the palm fronds and small branches lining the orchard. The sound of their crackling footsteps in the crisp evening air was muted by the rising furor they heard in the wheat field and over their heads. Propelling themselves forward at breakneck speed to avoid capture, they ran through the trees to the north, hearts pounding in their ears, every breath a painful gasp. If they could just get some distance from him and from the hut, then maybe you can read the rest in the book. Among the soldiers serving with us the night that Saddam was captured was Ian Weichel and Mark Payne. Let me try to get out of this here. Hang on. Back it up manually here. Ian was in the orchard that these two guys were running through. In fact, it was one of their men, Sergeant John Iverson, that actually captured Caius and his brother, who was Saddam's cook and his driver. Little did he know that when he was at West Point in the late 90s with Mark Payne, that they would be in the same unit making history at the same location on the same night. 15 months later, returning to Iraq on their second tour, now they were each in command of their own companies. And there you see Ian in the hole. That was the size of it. It wasn't very big. Ian was about my size. And there he is, stripped of his gear, and he can just fit in. It was like a 6-foot folding table that you would crawl under and sit down. Well, in April of 2006, leading his troops in a combat operation, he was killed by enemy fire. He left behind a wife and a small child who was born on his first tour while he was in Iraq with us. 6 months later, ignoring his injuries from a roadside bomb blast, Mark Payne ignored those injuries and led his soldiers on a raid the next day in which he was killed by enemy fire. So those of us that knew him, we traveled once again to Arlington National Cemetery to pay our respects to a fallen friend, just like we did Ian about 6 months before. If you've been to Arlington, they have an Iraq and Afghan section of the cemetery. And as they lay them in the order that they're received, they go down and they'll make a row, and as they receive them, they just keep making rows that weave back and forth down the cemetery. Beautiful, manicured. And as we followed Mark's caisson out to the burial site, we were stunned that he was buried at the feet of Ian Weichel. Roommates at West Point, companions in battle, and now together forever. After the burial, I wandered around our nation's capital while waiting for my flight to go out the next day. And at that time, in the fall of 2006, everywhere there was the melancholy prophecy of doom and gloom. Politicians on both sides of the aisle thumped their chest about the worthlessness of our service and our cause, with predictions that the war was lost and that we should abandon the mission. And in this setting, I walked around the Capitol Mall, trying to process a great number of things. I was drawn to a very ornate, Victorian-looking building that was the National Air and Space Museum. Entering it for distraction, I was drawn to the central exhibit, the Wright Flyer, the world's first airplane, and amazed by it and what this invention had caused in the course of human history. I walked around the rotunda where it was displayed, and you could see how they made it and read the stories all along the way. And everywhere that you would read, they had the naysayers, the critics, saying it would never fly. Looking at it, it's hard to believe that it ever did, or that it struggled into the air and they would risk life and limb to do so. Coming out of this gallery, I saw a sturdier looking craft with a title blazoned on the cowl, Spirit of St. Louis. And what amazed me about this craft was that it had no forward-looking window, just a forward-looking pilot at the controls. But if you read the press accounts of the day, you hear the naysayers. There they are. You'll never get off the ground with the weight of all of that gasoline. You'll never stay awake. And you can't do it alone. Man was not meant to cross such distances. You're going to die, you fool, just like all the others, more experienced flyers, aces from World War I that have lost their lives. What are you thinking? And as I rounded the corner to examine spacecraft, I was struck by what to me looked like aluminum foil, and pondered the physics of it and wondered how it could sustain life in outer space. How was it that we found Americans foolish enough to believe that you could be strapped into a rocket containing 2,000 metric tons of fuel that by somebody's design would throw you into outer space, and that because of someone's calculations and theories, you would find your way heading towards the moon as it would break apart. And then once you got close to it, the final portion of the craft would break apart yet again, be able to control itself, meet back. And because of a theory of gravity, they would be able to hold themselves around the moon. And then astronauts would crawl in, separate themselves without dying, and they would land this on the surface. Guys would get out, plant a flag, collect a few rocks, get back in, pop back up, and amazingly, because of someone's theory of gravity, they would be able to find the other craft again, even though you had the expanse of the moon. Get back into the mothership, and with a slingshot theory of gravity, head back towards the Earth at thousands of miles an hour. And don't worry about the speed, because the fiery atmosphere will slow you down. But don't worry about that, because we'll put these little asbestos plates on the bottom and they will protect you from becoming toast. And as you hurl through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour, parachutes will deploy and you'll land in the Pacific Ocean, and a helicopter is going to come and find you. And yet, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what this country did. And as you go back and you read the reports of the day, there they are. The cynics, the critics, the naysayers, saying things like, what about the war on poverty? What about the domestic issues here at home that are far more important than this frivolous race with the Russians? How much more national treasure do we have to expend on these frivolous pursuits? And yet, as I left the National Air and Space Museum, I left inspired, because it dawned on me that America has never been built on the labor and expertise of the cynic and the critic. What do we learn from men like that and Americans like that? That it's still worth pursuing dreams and pursuits and the greatness of our country. What do we learn from guys like this that come home from their war? Well, perhaps this: there are still things worth fighting for in the United States of America. America has never been built on the labor and expertise of the cynic and the critic, ever. And if we want to honor guys like Ian Weichel and Mark Payne, then we got to sacrifice a few things along with these guys. Like what? How about sacrifice doubt, sacrifice anxiety, sacrifice cynicism, any notion that will cause us to come home from our war as losers because we failed them here at home and didn't have enough grit to back them up while they were in the field. If we truly want to honor them, the true heroes of this war, guys like Ian and Mark who will never come home, never know the joys of marriage, never know the joys of raising a family or living to their ripe old age in the freedoms that their sacrifice purchased and watching their grandchildren play, then we have to honor it with a commitment to the things that we know are true and not give in. I want to encourage you tonight, keep the faith. Don't quit. God bless you all. I'll be happy to take your questions.